my side of this coin is going to be to talk about creating urban food forests, which are spaces designed specifically to provide those two things that Marla was talking about: food and supplies for people on the one hand, and abundant ecosystem services on the other hand, like cleaning the water, building soil, providing some measure of wildlife habitat. So that is what a food forest is about wherever it occurs, whether it's out in the countryside or in the city or anywhere in between. And today I'll focus first on the sort of horticultural side of creating a food forest, and then the human side, and draw on examples taken from my 10-acre research food forest site in Bowie, and then a couple of urban food forest parks that I've gotten to design and help implement. I will say that I'm going to move pretty quickly through this material because there is a lot, and I would love it if anyone has follow-up questions after the webinar. I'm more than happy for you to be in touch with me with questions about creating a successful food forest in your community. So to begin with, I'll show some slides from Bowie, Maryland, illustrating some of the broad horticultural principles of creating a food forest, which has also been known as a forest garden, especially in Europe, they call it that, forest agriculture of various forms. It's going to be a layered system where we're mimicking the forest, trying to combine plants that occupy different niches, rather than, if you picture a traditional orchard where all the trees are growing in one layer. We're trying to combine plants of every stature and mimic the functions of the forest that way, because it's actually, we found possible to produce more food by layering the vegetation that way, as well as more ecosystem services. If you're just planting one species of plant or even one layer of plant, you're missing out on a lot of the potential of that piece of ground and just not providing the biodiversity that you would find in a wild forest. So we try to mimic that as far as we can in the food forest that we create, while keeping it organized enough that we can fit a harvest with reasonable efficiency. So here's a shot from forested where you see an apple tree grown in conjunction with some of the native asters, plum tree in the background, taller trees, comfrey to build soil underneath. And building soil is an important piece of the picture too. So food forests don't consist strictly of plants that are for provisioning people with food and other supplies, but also plants that build soil. And there's all kinds of cool examples of this that agronomists and soil scientists have discovered, how if you combine different species rather than growing just one species, they play different roles in the soil ecosystem that underpins the health of the whole system and human health. Here's an interesting example on the screen from the Nature and Properties of Soils. They grew two different species, a sugar maple and a hemlock, in the same soil, and they watched as the sugar maple raised the pH of the soil that it was growing in over time. And this is because the sugar maple happens to have a deep-reaching root system that is efficient at scrounging calcium, a trace mineral important to plant growth, from deep in the subsoil. It brings it up into the plant. The leaves of the sugar maple tree are enriched in calcium. Those fall on the soil and break down, and over time they watched as the pH of that soil and the richness in calcium rose relative to the hemlock. So this illustrates that every different species of plant has a different effect on the soil. And we can make use of this mining effect, this documented ability of plants to pull trace minerals from the deep subsoil and add them to the topsoil over time, with that comfrey plant that you saw on the previous slide, that green thing on the right there, being a good example of a plant that pulls calcium, phosphorus, potassium, various trace minerals up and adds them to the soil over time. So we include plants in the polyculture, in the group of different species that are known to improve the soil, to feed the soil, because a lot of our urban soils, and indeed a lot of our agricultural soils, are incredibly beat up. They're deficient in organic matter and they need to be built. And so we try to work with plants that are known to do this in specific ways, while being humble to the fact that there's a lot we, of course, don't understand about how the soil is built. So we use the information as far as we can. Here are some examples from Forested, my demonstration site in Bowie. Here you have familiar plants, a red clover. which is a nitrogen-fixing legume that's adding fertility to the soil. Year over year, we seed these things into new food forest sites often when we have the opportunity. The other plant here is, with a yellow flower, is called partridge pea. It's a great native nitrogen fixer where you can actually get a decent quantity of the seeds for a reasonable price, and they compete well in tall grass situations. So I love partridge pea. A lot of the native plants you have to pay quite a lot. You'll pay $10 for a couple ounces of seed, and so at a broader scale, it's impractical in some cases. So partridge pea has been a neat one, and we've tried a bunch. Okay, so another piece of the diversity, the puzzle in a food forest, before we get on to some examples of fruit and the people that eat the fruit, is diversity to support insects. And these insects are, insect diversity and the bird diversity that follows the insect are incredibly important to a healthy ecosystem and a healthy food forest that's mimicking the wild forest. So this is a neat study from a Canadian entomology journal. It may be that the citation fell off the bottom of the page here, but I can link you to it if you want to email me afterwards. They found in unsprayed orchards in southern Canada and in New England, the orchards experience pest pressure, but introducing an understory of native shrubs reduced the pest pressure on the apple orchard and reduced the crop damage that was being done by the pests. And how this worked is in any orchard, you're going to have a certain amount of pests that are damaging your crop. And you'll have some predators, that's represented by the blue arrows, that will consume some of the pests. The predators would be birds or spiders, praying mantises, other things that will take care of some of the pest insects. By introducing a diverse understory in these orchards, they brought in a much increased diversity and abundance of insects into that system. And what that does is now if you're a predator, if you're a bird that eats insects or a spider or a mantis or whatever, you now have a much better selection and a much more sustainable environment for living your life. So again, these were unsprayed orchards. They're not controlling pests with chemicals. But in these situations, they found that introducing the native understory brought just massively up the diversity of helpful predators and reduced the impact on the crops. So we take this to be very important in designing our food forests. We try to mix it up as much as possible and include a lot of plants that are just there to support the diversity that will allow the whole system to be more diverse, to be more resilient, because there's less likelihood that any given singular pest species will get way out of hand if you have a large diversity and a lot of predators. So here's a couple of examples of that. Winterberry holly is a native holly. That is one of the plants that they used in that study that I just cited. This is it growing out at forested. It's known to support various bird species that you want to have in the system that also eat insects. Here is a neat example. This wasp is a native called Scolia dubia that eats Japanese beetles, but it does that only in its larval stage. So that wasp will go into the ground and lay its egg into the larva of a Japanese beetle, and that's been a big pest in the food forest in early years. But what we see is as the years go by, these wasps have become increasingly abundant. But the key here is that the wasp right now is not eating a Japanese beetle. It's eating its adult food. And for many of these parasitic wasps, nectar is their important food. And at the time when they're flying, they cover every plant in the mint family and these goldenrods, to the point that you can tell that the limiting factor on this population may well be the nectar supply. So it's very important to have a diverse nectar supply to maintain a healthy predator population. So we include as many native insectary plants as we can in the food forest to try and support these populations. And I'll just flip through a couple of the other predators that we're trying to provide habitat for. This is a native assassin bug or wheel bug, a potent predator. I have even seen it eating Japanese beetles, for example. There's a slide of that where I caught the guy. They actually will stab their prey and then liquefy their insides and suck it out. It's kind kind of satisfying if you've ever experienced Japanese beetles defoliating your grapes and your cherry trees. But moving on, we have a couple of really beneficial support plants here. False indigo bush is a native legume in the sort of large shrub size with the purplish-looking spikes on it on the left there. That's a wonderful soil builder. You can chop that plant to the ground and it will resprout. And those cuttings that you take off of it are a nitrogen-rich fertilizer. So we're growing some of the fertilizer for the food forest right on there, the way that soil builds naturally with nitrogen-fixing plants. On the right is a native plant called ninebark that supports a huge array of bees ranging in size from the big carpenter bees all the way down to these nearly invisible tiny native and everything in between. Love that plant when it's blooming. Again, trying to support the diversity in the food forest. And just one more example there. That yellow in the background is Maryland senna, another mid-sized, sort of a real large herbaceous nitrogen fixer, and it's high bush cranberry in the foreground. Right, so moving on to the people in the food forest. And if I had to pick one, people are definitely the more important factor in whether a food forest succeeds or fails. If you create the perfect food forest planting and people don't understand, the people that live in that neighborhood don't understand what it's about, or don't have someone to be an ambassador and introduce it to them, the food forest will not function as a food forest. So the education is a huge part of making this a success. And it's a really pleasurable part, too. It's great. I really love having kid groups out to forested. And I tend also to focus on what kids do and what they like in the food forest and their parents kind of in that order, because kids seem to be especially open to learning and trying new foods and gaining confidence around that. So I'll just show you, just to sort of wet your whistle, I'll give you a few of the things that they seem to love. They love cherries. This is a bush cherry. This is not a native plant. I do not grow strictly native plants, although I have a strong bias toward them. I do include some non-native. Bush cherry is a wonderfully well-behaved and ornamental plant if you have a park-type situation where a certain level of ornament is required. This is the native black raspberry, which my kids absolutely love. There are cultivated varieties. This is one of those things in the food forest that will start producing fruit in a year or two rather than having to wait, 4 or 5 years for some of the bigger fruit trees. So it's a great one to include, and it can look pretty tidy if you provide a nice trellis for it, even though it is a bramble. Wonderful plant. And I throw this photo in here, too, just to illustrate the magic of kids. All those kids in that photo are holding clusters of wild grapes. We have a bunch of different species, a cluster of different species of native grape, and they're mostly crunchy, sour, sort of mouth-puckering grapes. But the school groups that come out to the forest garden here in Bowie, the kids are always clamoring for more. I'll pass out some clusters of grapes, and they quickly gobble them up and ask for more. And it just goes to show that they'll surprise you sometimes in what, adults often wouldn't go for something like that. So we're working on cultivating, more traditional table grapes in the forest garden. But, why fight it? We have tons of this wonderful crunchy sour grape, and it's really popular with the kids, incredibly nutritious. I would argue more so in great likelihood than what they would get in the grocery store. Why not encourage this in all of our neighborhoods for the sake of the kids' health and the ecosystem that benefits from the native plant being there? All right, and just a couple more fruits. I wanted to show you this wonderful productive plum tree fruiting beautifully under a canopy of oak. There's a common misperception that you can't grow any fruit unless it's in full sun. We do try to maximize sun exposure in a forest garden through careful arrangement of our layers, but you can also get, if not 100%, you can get a good 70% crop on a bunch of your traditional fruit trees, even in quite a lot of shade, and it's worth pushing these plants to see what they can do in some amount of shade, because likely some amount of shade is where their wild ancestors were originally selected from. And so I would say take any of those nursery catalog recommendations for full sun for every last thing that they carry, take that with a grain of salt, because we've had a lot of success growing in quite a lot of shade. And I'm happy if you want to contact me afterwards. I've got a separate list of shade-loving productive plants, or shade-loving or shade-tolerating, I should say. Here's an apple. In the Northeast anyway, it's all about selecting varieties that are resistant to the diseases. We grow some apples because people love apples. It's definitely not the easiest thing to grow organically and without spraying, which are two different things. There are organic sprays you can use, but diversity alone does not seem to do it for apples. However, we keep trying. Hazelnuts are wonderful. That's a shrub that produces nuts. Really helpful if you have a small site and you want to include some nuts and you don't have the space for, say, a giant pecan tree or something. Hazel is a smaller nut. Chestnuts are wonderful. You can grow Chinese chestnuts. There's starting to be some availability of the hybrid American chestnuts to bring those back, and I'm excited to see those be planted out. All right. So there's a slide of forestry we get to have a lot of people through. And then just real briefly, I think Hyattsville, Maryland is a cool example of an urban food forest. They recently passed what I think of as one of the first resolutions that calls for food forests among other public health measures to help the population of Hyattsville, which I think really speaks to their vision for restoring the environment and human health and the value of creating food forests for doing that. So this project was begun by the mayor and the Public Works Department of Hyattsville, and it occurs in a rather urban neighborhood with small homes mixed together with light industrial. This neighborhood is cut off from surrounding areas by railroad tracks, and the space that they selected for the project is a really important piece of green space in this neighborhood context. It's one of the bigger green spaces there and hadn't been used for anything for a couple of generations. And so I think it was a neat site for them to choose to do this project. Just a couple words on the design. I would tend to, if it were just up to me, I would tend to fill the entire parcel with trees. My favorite people in some cases are trees, but for human-centric design, people like good long views, which helps with security issues, and they like a place to run around and play and throw a frisbee as well as the fruit. So you can actually, by creating a reasonably dense edge on a south-facing side, get a lot of plants in there and still leave those open spaces that are so often needed in urban space. I wouldn't have wanted to use up this entire parcel with plants, even if that had been an option. Because it's an important spot for this neighborhood. So there's a lot of different ways you can configure a food forest so that it has to be inviting to people, as well as getting its horticultural jobs done. And we just had the ribbon cutting on this project, and there's a couple others that are around the DC area that I've gotten to work on that I can mention. But it's really fun to see the kids come out, to see them try fruit, begin to learn to cultivate these plants, the kids and the elders and everyone in between. So I will say another thing that we found, because when you plant a food forest like this one just like a month ago, it's going to be a while before these plants are producing a whole lot in the way of fruit. So using other food forests to propagate the next ones is a good way to get it going. So we have planned a series of picnic community events where I can bring a big box of fruit from my food forest, which is old enough that it's producing well by now, so that we can bring this out to these new parks, have an event, take care of the trees, and everybody can try the fruit now that's going to be being produced later in this space to help bridge the early years that are not as productive. And it is just wonderful to see the people that these type of projects attract. It's just the most fun group. And then to that point, I wanted to mention just one other case study here before I wrap up. Greenbelt Food Forest was really inspiring for me because the nonprofit that founded the food forest and brought me in to help with the design is so great at partnering with the community. So they got permission, obviously, from the top, the mayor and the city council, but they also partner with, for example, this group is a dance troupe who came out to do some interpretive food forest dancing in the new food forest, and they partnered with Watershed. I forget what the group is called, but it's a water quality monitoring and education group in the environmental class. There, design groups. This is a local permaculture class that got to have input on how the food forest went together. And they're just strong volunteer network, which is so key to having these things be successful, because you need community involvement, but you also need somebody with whom the buck stops for any of these projects that makes sure that the plants are watered in the first years and mulched and the wheat pulled out. And it takes some staying power, but it's so worth doing, because as they mature, the workload lessens slightly and they become more fruitful. So if you can make it through the early years, food forests are incredibly worthwhile. And with apologies again for my sort of caffeinated pace, there was a lot I wanted to say. But just to wrap up, I hope that I see food forests as being an incredibly important thing for our neighborhoods, for kids to be able to have the opportunities to forage and become acquainted with caring for the plants, and having access to fruit that some folks wouldn't have access to because of the price point in the grocery stores, and learning to enjoy some of these incredibly important for health and environment, human health and environmental health plants. So that my hope would be that food forests of every scale would become as common in our neighborhoods as are amenities like swing sets and sliding boards, playgrounds, because that connection to the food that we eat and the confidence to the expectation that you'll grow up and then grow some of your own food and eat fresh berries and fruits is incredibly important to having a person grow up healthy and enjoying the neighborhood where they are. So that is all I have to say, and thank you very much for listening.